I have always had a normal life, just like any other teenager. It was 2019, and I was a sophomore in high school, surrounded by tests, extracurricular activities, and the typical trips to the mall with friends. My name is Lucas, and at 16, my biggest concern was whether I could score well on my next math exam. However, a few nights changed my perspective completely. It all started on an ordinary week when, in the early hours of a Friday, I woke up paralyzed in bed. It was a strange feeling, as if my body could hear my heart screaming but couldn't obey. My senses were on alert, and even though I couldn't move, I could hear the muffled sound of the wind outside and the distant ringing of a bell. That night, the atmosphere in my room felt heavy, as if something were present. The feeling of dread grew within me as I tried to look around. That was when I saw a dark shadow on the wall, outlined by the moonlight. The silence became almost deafening, and the shadow seemed to move as if it were slowly approaching. I tried to scream, but no voice came out. I was trapped in that paralyzed state, which seemed to last an eternity. Finally, when I managed to break free, I woke up sweating and with my heart racing. The first sensation I had upon opening my eyes was relief, but that quickly turned into confusion. What had that been? I wasn't sure if it had just been a nightmare. In the following days, I began to feel an increasing sense of fear. The sleep paralysis episodes became frequent, happening almost every night. I tried to avoid the gaze of my friend Gabriel, who always told me about his own nightmares, but when I finally opened up to him, his response was completely unexpected. You won't believe it, but I've heard other people talking about this too. It's like we're being visited at night, he said, mixing seriousness with a hint of disbelief. But the idea of night visitors intrigued me. Knowing that I wasn't the only one going through this only fueled my fear. Yet at the same time, a dark curiosity began to form within me. So, in this environment of storytelling and mystery, I was drawn into an ancient legend that circulated in our school. There were rumors about an entity that appeared on dark nights, dragging those who crossed its path into a state of terror and confusion. Talking with other friends, like Manu and Tiago, I discovered that they had heard similar whispers. The legend spoke of a spirit drawn to insecurity and fear, feeding off the victim's energy as they slept. With each conversation, more details emerged, weaving a tapestry of stories that left me both unsettled and intrigued at the same time. It was a Friday night when I decided, driven by courage and curiosity, that I would investigate this legend further. Armed with a notebook and a pen, I resolved to gather all the information I could find. Once night fell, I invited a few friends over to my house, creating a camping atmosphere with lanterns and everything. The tension in the air was palpable. As we began discussing the stories and their characteristics, I started to notice a pattern. Everyone mentioned feelings of premonition and a desperate urge to escape. But there was something more. The faces began to morph into dark memories, and that left me both intrigued and horrified at the same time. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I decided we would venture into the nearby forest where the legend was said to have originated. The darkness of the night seemed to engulf everything around us, and with each step we took, our nerves increased. The sound of twigs snapping under our feet echoed like a distant call to what was to come. As we approached a clearing, a feeling of unease and discomfort washed over me. A cold breeze swept through the area, and for a moment, I felt like we weren't alone, but at the same time, the adrenaline of the adventure only heightened. As soon as we returned home, the night took an unexpected turn. Once I lay down, the usual terror began to close in on me again. The paralysis kicked in. The familiar sensation of that oppressive presence returned, and this time it felt more intense. Mere shadows danced on the walls, and as soon as I got home, the night took an unexpected turn. Once I lay down, the usual terror began to close in on me again. The paralysis kicked in. The familiar feeling of that oppressive presence returned, and this time it felt more intense. Shadows danced on the walls, and I could feel the temperature in the room plummet drastically, as if an icy wind had come for an unwelcome visit. The silence was pierced by a whisper, an indistinct voice that seemed to crawl through the shadows. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but my instincts warned me otherwise. It felt as if the darkness was whispering something just beyond the reach of my ears. However, a part of me was hopeful this would be the last episode and that I could finally rid myself of this never-ending experience. I believed that the fear of details, the anxiety, and the school legends had turned into a storm in my mind, making the experiences feel more vivid and terrifying. As my vision tried to focus on what was in front of me, the shadow took on a distinct form with sharp contours. It was as if it was staring back at me, studying every move I made. In a moment of desperation, I finally managed to break free from the paralysis and the feeling of panic mixed with an impulse to flee. As I got up, I was startled to see my reflection in the mirror. My own image looked distorted, like a reflection in murky water. I definitely wasn't alone. The thought that there might be something else in that room terrified me. What I didn't expect was that this wasn't just a personal experience. As the days passed, other people began to ask about their own nighttime experiences, and what started as mere curiosity transformed into a vicious cycle, feeding our collective fear. What I dreaded most wasn't the presence, but the feeling that it could be something we couldn't see. In the mind of any teenager, that's the kind of combination that could drive someone insane, and at that moment, my life was turning into a real horror story. I decided I needed to break this cycle. I started researching online about the experiences of others who had gone through those same anguishing nights. I found out that sleep paralysis is fairly common, but nobody could clarify my doubts about the whispers and the enigmatic shadow. What began as a simple search for information slowly turned into an obsession, and I caught myself spending hours on the internet analyzing everything I could find about local legends and that tormenting spirit. Each search left me more restless, but at the same time, I felt a spark of determination igniting inside me. Something had to be done, and I couldn't let this force continue interfering in my life. Visualizing the sleepless nights spent in the school library, I began collecting fragments of the legend, creating a mural of references that seemed to guide me in search of answers. I decided that I would confront this presence, or at least learn more about it. So, I planned a meeting with some of the others who were also having these experiences. It was not just about understanding what was happening. It was about dismantling the hold that this shadow had over our minds. If there was a way to confront my fears, I was ready to find it. Eventually, we chose a specific night for this, as a way to break the atmosphere of panic that surrounded us. We formed a group of 4 and decided that if what made the shadow feed off fear was real, the best approach was to take that fear out of the equation and face the situation with courage. We set up a small camp in my backyard with a fire and everything, believing that the light might protect us. The idea of starting some sort of ritual, even if we didn't go into details, made us all feel a sense of unity against fear. What I wanted was to create an environment in which our collective energy could cover the shadows. The minutes dragged on in a mix of anticipation and fear, but with each laugh we shared around the campfire, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. Every time we shared our experiences, it felt like that oppressive presence dissipated a little more. Then, something I didn't expect happened. As midnight approached, the flames of the fire began to flicker, and a colder breeze, different from before, swept through the yard. As the leaves of the trees started to tremble in a way that felt almost alive, our animated conversation faded as the whispers within us became echoes of our own anxiety. Then, finally, the shadows began to project shapes onto the grass. Or was it just our imagination? The tension we felt quickly transformed into a tautness, as if our laughter were summoning something into our presence. With every snap of a twig, our gazes met, and for a moment, each of us seemed to see something that could easily be mistaken for movement in the dark. However, instead of running, we stood still, waiting, challenging whatever might come to haunt us. I didn't know if I was scared or just anxious in my quest for answers. With a confident gesture, I decided to break the silence. "Hey, if you're here, show yourself." The words came out like an involuntary shout, echoing into the night. There was no response, just the breeze and the distant sounds of crickets and owls. But the tension still lingered among us. caught between fear and curiosity. Just when we thought the night would be another one waiting for the dawn, movement stirred in the shadows of the clearing. As the darkness deepened, I began to visualize a contour, a clearer shape emerging from the void that seemed to be noticed only by me. My heart raced, and in a fleeting moment, the shadow conjured images of what tormented me. Dark, deep eyes that shone with a silent malevolence. Altogether, it appeared to be a figure shrouded in tattered robes, looking solemn as it approached. The impulse to run surged through me, but I resisted. The others began to notice as well, and a deafening silence enveloped our group. Nuances of dread and an almost primal urge to confront whatever it was took over us. But instead of silence, a voice softly whispered my name, as if articulating something just beyond the reach of reason. A voice both familiar and distant at the same time. Curiosity pulled me a little closer as the sensation of being watched intensified. "You don't have to be afraid," the voice said gently, as if trying to soothe me. But the mere presence of that shadow was enough to make me waver, torn between either fleeing or staying put. The figure seemed to be there, not just as a threat, but as a guardian or some sort of dark guide. I couldn't understand what this presence wanted from me, but there was a strange connection, a feeling that it too was trapped, just like I was. The temperature in the air dropped drastically, and the darkness seemed to thicken around us. It was almost as if the night were closing in, impenetrable and full of secrets. The figure seemed to be there not just as a threat, but as some sort of guardian or dark guide. I couldn't understand what this presence wanted from me, but there was a strange connection, a feeling that it too was trapped, just like I was. The temperature in the air dropped drastically, and the darkness seemed to thicken around us. It felt almost as if the night were closing in on us, impenetrable and full of secrets. As the figure continued to watch me in silence, I noticed the rest of the group was also paralyzed, caught in a state of fear and fascination. No one dared to move. The only sound was our heavy breathing, each exhale seeming like a call to the unknown. Something within me began to calm, and against all odds, a wave of understanding washed over me. I was not merely standing before an evil spirit, but perhaps a reflection of my own fear, something that had been feeding off my anxiety and uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, I resolved that I could not continue like this. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. To my surprise, the shadow did not retreat. Instead, it seemed to shift slightly, as if trying to communicate in some way. The whisper grew louder, forming heavy words like the clouds gathering on the horizon. "Freedom," the figure seemed to whisper. The weight of that word settled in my heart. It was as if I was dealing not only with an external force, but with something that was a part of me. With this epiphany, I glanced at my friends, who also seemed to be reaching a growing understanding. We were not just victims. We were all the ones who had created our own fear. Keeping that in mind, we formed a circle, intertwining our hands. In a surge of courage, I decided to harness the energy that had always held us captive and transform it into something different. We began to affirm a mantra of strength, loudly and in unison, challenging the darkness to dissipate and reclaiming control of our lives in an attempt to bring a conclusive end to this. To my surprise, as the group's energy rose and our voices resonated, I felt the pressure in the environment shift. The shadow began to dissolve, floating slightly as if it were being absorbed by the moonlight filtering through the trees. The voice that had once been oppressive now carried a more peaceful tone, almost like a distant lament fading into the air. As the wind started to blow, we felt the last remnants of that malignant energy disappear. By the end of the invocation, the last echoes fell silent, and a sensation of liberation washed over us. The weight that had once hung over our shoulders had finally been lifted. When I looked at my friends, I saw a mix of relief and disbelief on their faces. We all shared a burden that, in some way, had united us in a transcendental event. The figure that had once caused so much fear was now just a reminder of what we faced together. The sleep paralysis gradually diminished, and in the nights that followed, I returned to restful sleep. Though the legend still lives on in the stories at school, its narrative transformed into a metaphor for how fear can control us. Yet when confronted collectively, it can also be dissipated. Lastly, I realized that what I experienced was not just a struggle against a strange entity, but a journey of self-discovery. I learned that the true monsters are often those we create in the shadows of our own insecurities. Now, even after this experience, I still carry with me the feeling that what hides in the darkness is not necessarily a threat. Instead, it could be an invitation to confront and understand our own demons. We moved to a new city at the start of 2020, and like any change, it was filled with excitement and a touch of anxiety. My name is Anna, and I had just turned 28 years old. It was a time when I was trying to start fresh after ending a complicated relationship that had lasted for years. The new city seemed promising, with its tree-lined streets and that sense of tranquility I had been yearning for. However, as the days passed, I began to feel a strange presence, as if something was watching my every move. This became particularly evident during my afternoon jogs, when the sun still shone brightly and the environment should have felt safe. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a result of stress and the abrupt change. But it didn't take long for the feeling to intensify, along with a nagging unease in the pit of my stomach. While jogging in the nearby park, I noticed a figure standing at a distance, always in the same spot on different days, almost like a landmark on my route. It was a tall woman with dark hair, cascading over her shoulders, wearing a long dress that seemed to merge with the shadows around her, making her appear almost ethereal. Even though I tried to ignore her, her gaze seemed to follow me, as if a beam of invisible eyes was glued to me. That constant sensation of being watched began to affect my sleep, my runs, and even my daily interactions. What intrigued me the most was that when I mentioned it to some neighbors, I found out that several of them had also reported having similar experiences. They described the same feeling of being watched, that there was a presence in the city observing them from afar. While we sat in a coffee shop, one of them shared that a few weeks prior, while returning home from work, a woman resembling the one I had seen followed her for a while before disappearing. Together, we tried to exchange information about possible sightings and how it made us feel. This seemed more than just a coincidence. There was a pattern, a web that connected us all in that feeling of discomfort and fear. A growing sense that there was something dark lurking in the community began to haunt me. In search of answers, we decided to meet again, but this time in a cozier and more private space. I told them how the woman always positioned herself in the same spot, and I noticed that they also remembered seeing her there at specific times, as though she were following a fixed routine. Together, we devised a surveillance plan, deciding to discreetly observe the area and figure out what was really going on. One of the women suggested that curiosity could be our ally, and thus we became an improvised investigative group. It didn't matter that we were just neighbors in a new neighborhood. We were now united by a fear that was beginning to transform into determination. On the day of our surveillance, armed with water bottles and snacks, we positioned ourselves on a park bench, ready to observe. The sun was shining brightly, and an air of expectation hung over us. As the hours passed, the desire to uncover the truth about the figure became palpable. When the sun began to set, we noticed the woman appeared again, exactly in the same spot. Our hearts raced, and adrenaline took over all of us. But this time, she wasn't alone. A group of people was with her, speaking in hushed tones, and suddenly the lights around us seemed to flicker, as if the atmosphere were shifting. This heightened the tension in the scene, and we could feel a strange energy emanating from that gathering. Desperate for answers, we decided to approach. Instead of viewing the woman as a distant shadow, we aimed to confront her directly. As we moved closer, the conversation taking place faded, as if something had been broken. When we finally reached her, a sense of panic began to overtake us. The woman looked at us, her black eyes piercing into our souls. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, and the tension in the air became unbearable. I didn't know what to do. but the other seemed just as paralyzed as I was. There was something in her eyes that exuded deep sadness mixed with an inexplicable terror. This was the first time I realized we weren't just interrupting something. We were also targets of something much larger than ourselves, an enigma shrouded in dark secrets. I felt a chill run down my spine as her words resonated in my mind, blending the images from our conversations with the neighbors with memories of that woman's distant gaze. Something profound was about to be revealed, and we were all about to plunge into a truth that perhaps we could not bear. Hesitant but determined, we decided to ask what was going on. "Why are you always here? What do you want from us?" I finally managed to force out the question that had been burning on my lips. The immediate silence that followed was palpable and heavy, as if the air itself was charged with tension. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the woman slowly turned to face our group and said, "We are being watched. We are not the only ones, but we are the only ones who see." Her words sounded like a warning, sending a chill through my entire being, as if we truly understood that we were being observed, not by this woman in particular, but by something invisible and terrifying. The blend of terror and confusion took over us. Looking around, I noticed that other figures were approaching, shadows moving between the trees, and before we could react, a whisper echoed throughout the clearing. What should have been a simple act of curiosity had transformed into a deadly game of cat and mouse, and we had all become victims of this story. The woman then added, "You need to go. You shouldn't get involved any more than you already have." And as those words formed on her lips, I sensed the truth of a deep secret that loomed over the city. After all, it wasn't just a feeling of being watched. It was a warning for the next victims. Looking away, I glanced at my friends, who appeared equally stunned. The adrenaline was pumping through our veins, but the web of fear was intertwined with a determination to uncover the truth. Not all of us were willing to back down. The idea that we were not just being watched, but that we might also be part of a larger intrigue, overwhelmed any pure sense of terror. In a moment of courage, I asked, "What do you know about this? Please tell us the truth." I didn't expect the answer to come in such a sudden and surprising manner. She hesitated for a moment and then lowered her voice. "In this city, some women have disappeared, and it's no surprise there's a connection between them. Those who watch have a particular interest in certain qualities." With each word, my heart seemed to race. What was this interest? What did it mean to be part of a recurring pattern? The other women and I exchanged looks of horror and confusion. What should have been a simple move to a new city was turning into a terrifying investigation of a web we hadn't expected. Desperate for answers, my mind spun, trying to comprehend the new reality. The woman then looked into each of our eyes, as if weighing our intentions. "If you're not careful, you could become the next ones just like the others. This is much deeper than you can imagine." With those words, a knot formed in my stomach, and the idea that we were not just spectators, but possible targets, left me paralyzed. As those words resonated in my mind, a sense of urgency grew. We needed to find out what was happening, and if there was a way to stop this, it was now or never. We decided to return and ask more questions of those neighbors who had shared their stories. The city was full of tales like this, and now we had a new perspective on what might be going on. Something dark and invisible was unfolding right under our noses, and we felt more united than ever. As we left the clearing and moved away from the woman, a wave of determination washed over me. We had to uncover the hidden mysteries in this new life, which should have been a fresh start, but was now revealing itself as a nightmare. And as we distanced ourselves, a lost gaze from the forest that followed me made me feel that the true terror was just beginning. It was a quiet autumn morning in 2023, and I had been living in the small town of Eldridge for about 3 years. My name is Carla. I'm 32 years old, and I've always led a peaceful life dedicated to my work at the local bookstore and my daily walks in the park near my home. The town had always held a rustic charm, with its cobbled streets and the trees whose leaves changed color, creating an almost magical atmosphere. However, Everything began to change when a group of residents started receiving strange messages from an anonymous hotline. At first, the messages seemed harmless, alerting us to severe weather events or changes in garbage collection schedules. No one paid much attention. They treated it like a joke or a hoax, but as the warnings grew more sinister, something grotesque began to take shape. Once, during a meeting at the town library, a woman who was a regular attendee and the leader of the community council started talking about the messages. She had piercing blue eyes and a strong presence, and her voice trembled as she recounted receiving a message warning of an evil that is approaching. An uneasy feeling spread through the room, and nervous laughter began to echo around us. Yet, deep down I felt there was more to it. The messages started to describe silent disasters, wildfires, serious car accidents, and strange diseases that would affect everyone. As she spoke, I noticed a faint whisper of fear among the residents present. It was clear that suspicion began to infiltrate our everyday conversations. 1 or 2 weeks later, a devastating fire broke out in a nearby forest, and to our horror, many residents began to believe that the messages were predictions of a larger-scale event. Reactions ranged from those defending the idea and trying to rationalize the hotline's logic to others, who outright denied any rationale and preferred to keep their heads buried in the sand. Amid all these discussions, I felt increasingly overwhelmed by the paranoia that was beginning to spread through the town. For many, the messages were not just predictions, but represented an undeniable truth that stirred a deep fear and distrust among neighbors. The small town that was once united was now divided. The atmosphere of anxiety was palpable, and trust in interpersonal relationships evaporated. At that time, I tried to stick to my routine, but I no longer felt safe taking walks alone. I began to notice glances and murmurs at street corners, whispers about the hotline, and the increasingly chilling warnings we received. The thought a terrifying future began to come to life, and what should have been a space for community was turning into a battleground. Amid this turmoil, the woman who took on the responsibility of alerting everyone became an icon among the residents. For some, she was a heroine warning us of what was to come. For others, she was an agent of chaos, inciting a state of hysteria. That night, as I tried to digest everything that had happened, I was awakened by strange noises coming from the street. The feeling of being watched returned like a whirlwind, and the idea that someone could be spying on us wasn't just paranoia. The entire town was living under surveillance. Looking out the window, I saw shadows moving through the streets, as if something were following us, waiting to reveal itself. The situation felt like a psychological thriller, where the lines between terror and reality began to blur. Breathing heavily, my mind spun with a dilemma of choice. Should I stay in the town or risk everything to uncover the truth behind the hotline and its apocalyptic messages? The next day, as dawn broke, I resolved that I needed to take action. I couldn't allow doubt and fear to overwhelm me. Joined by a few women who were also willing to investigate, we started to look for clues, talking to anyone who might have information about the hotline and the origin of the messages. What was meant to be a community duty was becoming a mission of courage. Armed with bravery and determination, we hoped to find something that could shed light on the shadow looming over our town. But whatever was there was watching us, and the thought of uncovering the truth made my heart race with anticipation and fear. During our search, we encountered an older man, a true town resident who knew its stories and secrets. He had white hair and a deep, almost sorrowful gaze, conveying years of wisdom and accumulated experience. Upon hearing our story, he shook his head slowly. "This hotline isn't a joke, ladies. If it's really predicting disasters, then something much bigger is at stake. You need to be prepared for what might come next," he warned. His solemn tone struck us like a wave of reality. The belief that a disaster could happen in our small town began to feel more tangible. Fear was being nurtured by information, and distrust took shape. After that encounter, the town seemed to have transformed into a labyrinth of mystery and paranoia, and the whispers became more intense. A meeting was scheduled for the following day, and my heart raced with each passing thought. Could we uncover the truth behind the messages? Or were we simply feeding a cycle of fear? Committed to being part of the solution, the other women and I decided to continue our search, hoping that knowledge could empower us amid the uncertainty. At that meeting, the air was heavy with expectations and fears, and all eyes were fixed on us. What followed was a powerful speech about unity and strength, an attempt to reclaim what we had lost, trust. But how could we trust again when every corner seemed filled with darkness and uncertainty? And so, as the town breathed a collective sigh of despair, a deep understanding settled in. We needed to confront not only the disasters that might be on the way, but also our own distrust of one another. By the end of the meeting, as the lights began to flicker, a sense that something imminent was approaching overwhelmed me. The eerily familiar gaze of the woman and the messages we had received echoed in our minds, revealing that the next disaster might not be an isolated event, but rather the effect of something much larger waiting to be unveiled. As I left, an inexplicable pressure settled in my chest. The end of the story in Eldridge was drawing near, and we weren't prepared for what that might mean.